Okay.
Okay, so,
Wait.
okay.
Claudia.
Okay.
So our group is Claudia Padilla, Maddie, Krista Padlan, and Elizabeth Weiler. And can you state your name?
Sounds like a police interview. Hi, yes. Okay, hi, I'm Alan Weiss. I'm Elizabeth's grandpa.
Okay, and let's just say the date. It is May 13th, 2014. It is 4:13 p.m. and we are in the location
Mr.
Bewley's project room. An interview topic: the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War.
Okay.
So how are you today?
Let me think about that one. No, I'm doing fine.
Are you comfortable sharing your experience with us?
But of course.
Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to be with us.
Anytime. Was that a question? It's like the good wife last night. You know? Anyway, go ahead.
How was your college experience?
How was it? Well, it was interesting. Okay, I grew up in New York City, but moved to Allentown, PA, where I met your wonderful grandma here. When it was the beginning, the first year of high school for me. But just because of when I was born, and because they sort of thought I was smart or something, I wound up starting high school pretty young, and I graduated 1 month after I turned 16. So I started college at 16. My family broke up then. My dad moved out from Pennsylvania to California. And so instead of going away to college like I was planning to, I had a scholarship and everything, I wound up having to go to school at home in Allentown, PA, Muhlenberg College, okay? And it was okay for the first year or two. I got into a fraternity, and I discovered that there were so many more fun things to do than homework and going to classes. There was the place I'd go to for coffee every morning and play the pinball machine. I got into the fraternity. I'd stay up all night playing cards. So early in my junior year, I flunked out. Okay, college experience. And I got a job. I was living at home, but I got a job. I had several things going on. I worked at a couple of the radio stations. I was an all-night disc jockey. I teamed up with another guy. We did folk music. We sang in the the coffee houses in Greenwich Village. And you guys see that movie? What was the movie that we just saw a couple months ago? Somebody's name. Pardon?
Lewin Davis?
Yeah,
Lewin Davis.
Lewin Davis. That's a movie about guys singing in coffee houses in New York in 1961. I was one of them. I was really there. I know. Did all that kind of stuff. Eventually, I got my act together, got back to school, went to New York University. They were kind enough to take me. And graduated from there, came out to California for graduate school at UCLA. That was all cool. That was a lot harder than anything I had ever done before. And I wound up getting into the field of what nowadays you might call quantum physics. You guys heard that term? Mm-hmm. Know what so you're all experts? Okay, cool. We called it elementary particle physics at the time. My dad was disappointed. He said you couldn't get into advanced particle physics, but we called it elementary particle physics. And I had to do a project. It was bigger than just a project, but it was a whole research thing for me to get my doctorate degree, which I eventually got. And I wound up doing my thesis experiment at UC Berkeley. And so, starting in about 1967, I was pretty much living in Berkeley. They let me come home like every other weekend. I think that was it, right? They gave me the plane fare to come home every other weekend, or I could drive. It was an interesting time. I was pretty busy at the time, but everybody that I worked with, we all had this concern because at the time, the Vietnam War, which had started as a real pain in the butt for lots of people, I guess, early 60s. President Kennedy even got us involved in that somewhat, but by the mid to later 60s, it was a disaster. There was no reason for us to be there. I mean, when it wasn't ever even called a war, but when it was over, it was like we accomplished nothing other than lots and lots of people got killed, Americans and Vietnamese.
They called it a conflict, right?
Yeah, they called it a conflict. But here's the key point. There's one thing that was different about that war or conflict than any other war or conflict since then. This was the very last thing that we got militarily involved in where the people who served in the military were subject to the draft. You guys know about the draft? Okay, you know, like the NFL. Right? Except this wasn't the NFL. So back then, whether you wanted to serve in the Vietnam War or conflict or whatever, didn't mean anything. Whatever you wanted meant nothing. If you got drafted, you went. That was that. Okay, and now they did have a thing back then at the time called student deferments, and since I was a student, a graduate student, but a student, I had a deferment. So in the beginning, I didn't have to worry about it for myself. But it was something that really didn't sit well with me or with Dottie here, or in fact, just about anybody I knew. We all thought it was just totally bogus. People were getting sent off to get killed, to kill people and to get killed, for no reason, absolutely no reason. The reason they gave us was that if we didn't win this war, we'd all become communists. That doesn't mean anything much to you guys. This is the mid-1960s. And after World War II, that ended in 1945, the Soviet Union, we call it was mainly Russia then, but a whole lot of other countries, but now it's just Russia. But the Soviet Union, the USSR, which had a communist government, sort of made overtures like they wanted to take over the world. They're kind of doing it again, aren't they now? Putin. But anyway, that was something that everybody in the U.S. was sort of deathly afraid of. We didn't want to be communists. We wanted to have a democracy. We wanted to be able to do what we wanted to do.
Yeah, tell them about the slogans. They used to say, "I'd rather be dead than red."
Right.
Red meant that you were communist.
Right.
So
better
it's
dead than
better
red.
Dead than red.
Right. People, and this was in the escalation of nuclear weapons, and so people built bomb shelters. I mean, it was a scary time. It really was. One of the scariest times was right in the early 60s with it was called the Cuban Missile Crisis, when there were, we discovered that in Cuba, which was a communist country right on our doorstep in the Caribbean, they had Soviet USSR missiles pointed at the US. And that almost might have been the beginning of another world war, but somehow or other we squeaked out of that one. And Vietnam was just getting going during that time. So the whole communist threat was the big thing, and that was how they sold the Vietnam War to the American public. If we don't stop the North Vietnamese, who were communist, from taking over South Vietnam, which was supposedly a democratic republic, but it really wasn't. It had a puppet regime that we in the United States set up. But if we didn't stop the communists from taking over South Vietnam, they called it the domino effect. Then another country would fall and another country, and eventually the whole world would be communists. So that was the story. All right, so 1968, I'm working up in Berkeley. I was working at that time pretty much the midnight graveyard shift up at the big particle accelerator where we were doing my experiment. Just having a big atom smasher. Well, it was big at the time. I don't even think they use it anymore, but in its day, it was good stuff. And so I'd work there from about midnight till 8 in the morning, and then I would have all this other work I would have to do on the computers up there. This was at the Lawrence, they call it now the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. It used to be the Lawrence Radiation Lab, but in Berkeley. It was right above the UC Berkeley campus. Have any of you ever seen the Berkeley campus?
Yeah,
We were in college tour.
Pardon?
We went on a college tour.
Yeah, okay. It's really beautiful. I loved it. I took some classes down there, and the radiation lab was part of the university. So it was just another part of the university, but it was way up on top of the hill. Sometimes at sunset, we would sit there on the balcony of one of our buildings watching the sunset over the Golden Gate, and you could see the fog just rolling in through the Golden Gate. It would stop about halfway at the bay. We'd be perfectly clear in Berkeley, but anyway, it was coming in over San Francisco. So I would do my work on the computers and everything.
Tell them about the computer room. The computer. It's like the size of this room, that was the size of the computer. And they used to have,
bigger than that,
and
yeah.
they used to have cards with little hole punch cards.
Yeah, we had real computers back then. None of this nonsense. No, I mean, my cell phone is infinitely more powerful than the mainframe computers that I worked on both up there at the radiation lab and at UCLA. And even though they both took up entire floors of buildings,
Yeah.
and to get anything into the computer, you had to use these punch cards, the IBM cards they call them.
Boxes and boxes.
Right,
of
boxes and boxes
Yeah.
of cards. Yes, you remember it well, okay? So those were the good old days. And then I would, sometimes I would take a class on campus or whatever, but there was, even though everybody was really upset about the war, there was another issue that came up during this period, which is what this book is about. The university had a little plot of land in Berkeley, not really on the campus, sort of adjacent to the campus in Berkeley. And some students had this wonderful idea. They volunteered to turn it into a park that everybody could use as a public park. Well, the university was not happy about that at all, okay? And they just said no, and they put up
Barbed wire fencing.
barbed wire fences and all this other stuff, and it turned into a huge, big movement. In fact, they brought in the National Guard, soldiers with rifles standing there in front of the barricades.
Tear gas, everything.
Right, to prevent people from...
Students, these were just...
students and just hippies. A lot of hippies live in Berkeley then.
You could pass this around as
Yeah,
well.
so you can look at some of the
This
pictures.
is from 1968.
Right. Now, you know, the underlying issue here was related to the Vietnam War. It was all about authority. I don't know, you know, I find it interesting. Some people think that my politics are very left-wing, or not, I don't know, very liberal. At that time, I was so far to the left that I kind of felt the same way as the people who were on the other side that were so conservative, they were so far to the right that we both kind of almost felt the same, which was we shouldn't even have a government. Okay. We were approaching it for different reasons, but the idea was the same. Get rid of big government, let people do their own things. And this was very popular back then. During 1968, I still remember, it was when the Democratic Convention was being held, and the protests just about that were just phenomenal. Johnson said he wouldn't run again. He's the guy who got us up to our necks in the Vietnam War. And, you know, all the liberal hippies just didn't want to even have anything to do with Democrats or anything like that. In fact, that's when I was a member of the Peace and Freedom Party. Okay. All right, so I'm having all this fun, and anyway, we would do our demonstrations, and then I would go home, take a nap, get ready to do it all over again, and we'd watch ourselves on the news, you know, protesting. Okay, so that was my college experience. It was fun. Did all that graduate work for years. It took me 6 years, but I finally got my degree. The end. That was question number 1. That was college, huh?
Yeah. So what was your purpose for protesting against the Vietnam War?
Again, I don't like the idea of war at all. I was born during World War II. And all of my uncles, my mother's brothers, served in the military in World War II, and they volunteered. They weren't drafted. You've probably learned about World War II, and there's still lots of stuff, movies and things all about it. My dad had a military deferment, but he worked making engineering technical stuff for the military. Everybody during World War II wanted to participate because it was such a horrendous threat to our way of life. The first war that I was sort of cognizant of that came later was the Korean War. And I don't even know if that one was a war. It might have been a conflict. But whatever it was, this was North Korea versus South Korea. North Korea communist, South Korea not. That was not a popular war in the sense that people were running to the office and signing up to serve in the military. The Vietnam War was extremely unpopular, at least in the part of the country where I was at the time, the East Coast and on the West Coast. Middle of the country, it might have been a lot more popular. But again, they were drafting people left and right. Left and right. Oh, by the way, I forgot to put in one little last thing in the last question. I got pretty lucky. They ended student deferments while I was working on my stuff in Berkeley. They had a thing where they decided they would have a lottery.
Number.
Right. And so they took everybody's birthday, put it on a chip, and put it into the bucket, and started pulling them out. And if your chip was the first one pulled, you had a really, like 100% chance of being drafted. If your chip was near the end, you probably had a very low chance of being drafted. I was one of the lucky ones. My chip was near the end, so I did not get drafted.
It was like touch and go. And if he would have been, he wouldn't have gone.
Right, I would not have
The whole
gone.
family would have moved to Canada where you could live and not have to go to war.
Right.
So we were ready to do that.
So to answer your question, don't like the idea of war to begin with, but sometimes, once in a rare while, they're necessary. This war was totally unnecessary. It was fought purely for political and financial reasons. There was no danger ever to the United States or to our way of life. And so, more liberal strongholds, but yeah, it was the defining thing of the 60s. You know, we talk about 60s music and the hippie lifestyle of the 1960s and all that stuff, but all that underlying protest stuff, that was a huge part of our history, and fortunately, we can still protest today.
Compared to other college campuses, how do you feel that Berkeley stood out in anti-war activities, if at all?
Oh boy, they were at the forefront. I remember, yeah, I mean, if we weren't protesting, I still remember going down and seeing Angela Davis speak there. You know who Angela Davis is? I think she's still around.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
she is.
Right, and other people. It was right at the forefront of protests against this war. Absolutely. Much more so than UCLA, where I was a student, but I spent all my time at Berkeley.
How did you learn about all of the protests?
Everybody just knew, you know. I mean, there were flyers around town, everybody talked to each other, there would be stuff on the TV or the radio, everybody just knew. There was no internet, there were no cell phones, there was no Facebook or Twitter, but believe it or not, people actually talked to each other back then. I know, it's pretty old fashioned. Yeah.
Have you heard of the SFM, or the Berkeley Free Speech Movement?
Yeah, sure.
Was that related or involved with the protests?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if it was officially, but yeah, of course.
How did you feel about the FSM?
There were several things going on. Well, okay, now I can remember one thing that did leave an impression. I hadn't thought about it for a while. There were some of these movements that were kind of really radical. And another big issue back then was race relations. And I even got involved with what are the Black Panthers?
The SDS.
The SDS.
Students for a Democratic
I
Society.
think that was one of them, but there was another one that was more racial.
Yeah.
But they started going beyond what I thought was reasonable in terms of protests. I mean, they were condoning all kinds of illegal things where people would get hurt.
Mhm.
And the whole point of this was to keep people from getting hurt.
Yeah.
So I can't remember specifically what was going on, the FSM, but I know that this one group I was involved with, I got out of. And in fact, they didn't want any more white people in the group. It was mainly a group for black rights.
What about Bobby Seale? Was that the Black Panthers?
I can't remember
Yeah,
exactly who was with who and which one I was in, but it got to be too radical,
Yeah.
for me at least, which is hard to believe. Yeah, okay.
Do you remember any stories, particular, or events that happened in that group that made you want to quit?
No, I can't remember offhand. I could research it and find out, but I cannot recall
What about
offhand.
the Patty Hearst kidnapping? Was that part of it?
One of those groups was involved with that,
Yeah.
yes. That was one of the big stories back then. The kidnapping of Patty Hearst, she was
The daughter.
the daughter, or the granddaughter of,
Maybe, yeah.
I think she was the
William Randolph
granddaughter-
Hearst, you know,
granddaughter
Hearst
of-
Castle. Yeah, you've been there probably.
this William Randolph Hearst was
Newspaper.
he was a newspaper magnate, a billionaire, or the equivalent of a billionaire back then, very, very conservative. And one of the radical groups kidnapped his daughter and sort of brainwashed her,
Yeah.
and had her appearing as sort of a hostage on television, saying, you know, all this
Yeah.
stuff that was very, very radical.
Huge.
After you finished with your protests, did you still do anything to advocate for anti-war policies?
I've always done things a little bit, yeah. I mean, I didn't demonstrate anymore. I told you that for reasons of practicality, I wound up spending most of my career working in the defense industry. As did most of my college friends who all protested the Vietnam War. We all of us that were at UCLA together, there was a big group of us, all wound up working for the same aerospace defense company here in the LA area.
And how did you justify that?
Is she allowed to ask questions? No, you really, how do you justify something like that to yourself? And so here I will tell you how I justified that to myself. First of all, there were no more major conflicts after Vietnam, anything like Vietnam. There were a few. There was Bosnia. There were a few up until the war in Iraq. That was the next major. That was almost like a second Vietnam. But so there were no major conflicts going on. There were no major troop deployments anywhere. I think the Bosnia-Serbia thing was the biggest one I can recall. What we were working on in my part of this business was purely for defense purposes. It was the radars that went into fighter airplanes, mainly so that they could make sure they didn't get shot down. That was it. So I told myself, I'm not involved in making weapons. I gotta tell you one other thing. Most of my career was in this big company. My part of the company had nothing to do with making any weapons, and I didn't want to have anything to do with weapons. I did spend a few years working for a small company. We called it a Beltway Bandit company because while it was headquartered in San Diego, it had its biggest office on the Beltway. You know what that is? Outside of Washington, D.C.? Well, Washington, D.C. is surrounded by a series of freeways. They call it the Beltway. Okay? It's the only place I've ever been to where the traffic is equal to or worse than here. And are all around the suburban cities around Washington, D.C. are tons and tons of small companies. By small, I mean like under 1,000 employees. Not really small, not mom and pop. My company had 500 employees, and they were all there in that area because they were all trying to get work paid for by the U.S. government. So we were one of those Beltway bandits. And my little company, what I was doing, the program I worked on while I was there was a President Reagan special. Did any of you remember Star Wars? Okay. So we had this Star Wars program. Talk about wastes of money. But I worked for this little company that got a lot of money to work in the Star Wars program, which basically meant defending ourselves again from Soviet missiles. It was still Soviet in the beginning and then Russian later on, but it's defending ourselves from missile attacks, an early missile warning system, a missile defense system. That's what Star Wars was. The only problem was that while I was working on a Star Wars contract, which was absolutely, completely no weapons, my company was involved with nuclear testing. That was the main thing they did at my company. I never got involved in that, but the guy we were going to visit on Friday, he was the head of that part of the company. We didn't make nuclear weapons in this little company, but the company was involved with testing nuclear weapons. I stayed as far away from that as I could.
Do you ever still think about the protests today?
Only in the sense that you can't forget, because there's protests. I mean, there's things we're protesting now.
Look at all the things that are being protested today.
Right.
Gay rights, you know, you name it. I mean, they just, anything, people can protest, and that's what's good about our country. They're allowed to protest.
Right. The last time I specifically related it to what was going on back then was the war in Iraq. Again, at least it was another senseless war, absolutely nothing to be gained. Again, we didn't win the war, and there's no difference after we pulled out from before we pulled out. But the only big difference was there was no draft. So anyone who wanted to serve in Iraq could serve in Iraq. If you didn't want to serve, you didn't have to. But yeah, we protested that war just because we were killing all kinds of innocent people, and our own people were getting killed for absolutely no reason. But like Nano says, there's lots of other things to protest too. But that was the last big war protest.
At the time, how did you think that media affected your opinions?
That's a good one. Now, you know, media back then was newspapers and television. There was no social media. The TV definitely was a major influence on us and everybody else. TV grew up during this period. It really became, I mean, everybody had TV.
And in the movies, and when you go to the movies, before the main show, there'd be a newsreel, like 30 minutes sometimes,
Yeah.
of any war that was going on. And I used to hate that when I was a kid because I just, oh no, I just want the movie.
So, but you know, in terms of newspapers, it kind of depended on where you lived and what the paper was like. Papers tended to be politically slanted in one direction or another. Sometimes subtly and sometimes not so subtly. So, for example, the LA Times has always been branded as a liberal rag. And I guess if it leans in any direction, that would be the direction it leans in. The Wall Street Journal is quite the opposite.
Conservative.
Very, very conservative. But a wonderful paper. The writing is fantastic. In fact, the Wall Street Journal, the writing is so good that you don't even know sometimes you're being brainwashed for the conservative side of things. But they do such a good job. Okay. But yeah, during the Vietnam War protests and everything, it was all over the papers all the time. Remember Jane Fonda?
Oh yeah, Jane Fonda was big ants. Yeah. What do they call her? Something Jane. Oh, Vietnam Jane or something like that.
Yeah, I remember now.
But all the folk singers were really liberal, and all the words to their songs. You know,
Yeah, so music was another way that there was a lot of protests going on, still is to this very day.
Yeah.
Popular music, rock, folk, absolutely, sure.
What was your opinion on communism, and did it change over time?
No, it hasn't changed over time. I never thought it was a good idea. To me, it was almost like a religion, and I don't like religions either, so if I upset anybody, I apologize in advance.
Also, it was, you know what utopia is? It was so perfect, it seemed impossible to have a society that was so perfect that where everybody is equal. It just never happens that way.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you heard of an author. He only died a few years ago, but he was one of my favorites. When I was a kid, my favorite kind of reading was science fiction. I haven't touched it in decades, century, but back then I loved science fiction, and one of my all-time favorite authors was Kurt Vonnegut. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
Good author.
But if not, I recommend some of his books because they're beyond just normal science fiction.
Yeah.
And he wrote a lot about communism, only he didn't say he was writing about communism. His books were stories. He didn't mention communism.
Great.
But basically, it was this whole idea that if everybody is equal, which was all a big part of communism, this would be one miserable world to live in. of course, what we learned from another very famous book, 1984, by George Orwell, who wrote about communism using this metaphor of a farm of animals, was that in a society like communism, some people are more equal than other people, as he put it. Yeah, no, it's a rigid system. You are given it's a belief system, just like religion. This is what you will believe. This is the truth. And if you don't believe this, watch out. You may be killed.
Did you think that if you hadn't participated in the protests, your life would be different now?
Elizabeth, there are a gazillion different forks in the road you come to in your life. Any one of which probably would make your life different. So I don't know how to answer that question because I just did what I did. Of all the religions that I know anything the least little bit about, I guess the one, well, there's two, but they're sort of distantly related. One's Buddhism, the other is Taoism. But in the Taoist philosophy, or I don't even know if it's a religion, it's to go with the flow, okay? So I'm more of a go with the flow kind of person. So I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, I just did what I felt I should be doing. And yeah, if I did something else, maybe my life would have been totally different.
Do you ever think that you personally should have done something differently in the protest, which may have resulted in a different outcome?
No, I think, while I may be a go-with-the-flow person, I am also a Taurus. And so I have somewhere, well, I think, pardon me, it goes with being left-handed and the way your brain is wired. Part of me is very practical. Part of me is completely impractical.
I haven't read the practical part yet.
Anyway, no, there was nothing, I was practical enough to know there was nothing I could do individually that would make much of a difference other than what I was doing. I mean, can I make a difference in the world today? Yes, in fact, I'm embarking on doing just that, but it's not in the form of a protest.
What effects did the Vietnam War have on your home and family life before?
Biggest thing, like we mentioned earlier, biggest thing we mentioned earlier was if I were to have been drafted, what would we do? Because we were a family.
Yeah, we didn't like war.
None of us in the family liked war. At that time, I was the only one that could have been drafted, but had the war dragged on, you know, Billy
Yeah, Terry.
and Terry,
Kevin.
your dad,
They could have all been drafted.
they could have been drafted too.
So I wasn't going to let any of my sons go to war.
Right.
And before that, in World War II, if you didn't want to go to war, for moral reasons, you became a conscientious objector. And other people would look down on you and think you were a coward because you didn't want to fight for your country. But if you really felt this was an immoral thing to do, you could get out of going to war and be a conscientious objector. One of your great uncles was one for World War II, Royal either, you know. So I was in favor of that, because anything rather than killing people just seems so wrong.
How did people view you at the time?
You know, Elizabeth, I learned a long time ago that how other people view me doesn't mean a lot to me. Okay, I mean, I'm normal. I'm almost normal. Okay. In some regards, I'm normal. I want to be liked, like I think most of us like to be liked. But I don't do what I do in my life based on what other people think of me. All I can tell you, though, is at least at that time, everybody that I was associated with in my family, in the work I was doing at school, in everything, we all felt the same way, so no problems.
And I think we tended to gravitate towards friends who felt the same way we did about these things, because it's very uncomfortable being with people, even though you like them in some ways, when their political views are so different than yours.